Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of lifelong learning and alumni engagement at Washington and Lee, welcome to the next installment of our sustainability webinar. Tonight's segment is entitled Planet Water Pollution. We thank you for being with us and for taking the time to engage with the university. We're very fortunate to have three knowledgeable speakers with different fields of expertise with us this evening. Their detailed bios were included in the registration materials, but let me give a brief summary and welcome them to the program. W&L Professor Robert Humston teaches in biology and environmental studies. He is the director of the Environmental Studies program. He has a PhD in marine biology and fisheries. He will discuss what he calls freshwater stressors. In other words, the threats to water resources and freshwater ecosystems and how these connect with the health of our coastal oceans. Lisa Greer is a professor of geology and the co-chair of the University Sustainability Committee. She has a PhD in marine geology and geophysics. Her working title is, Can We Clean Up Our Oceans? Professor Greer's primary research area is coral reefs. She'll discuss how climate change and oceanic pollution are affecting the health of coral reefs and why that matters to all of us. Alumna Laura Henson Strickler, class of 2008, has a master's in international environmental policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. She was at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of International Affairs before joining the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the U.S. Department of the Interior. Laura will discuss how we can protect the blue planet through international policies and treaties. All three of our guests will present in order, and then we look forward to a good, lively question and answer session. Please use the question and answer function located at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, and please submit those questions as they occur to you. My colleagues Ruth Candler and Rob Fury from Lifelong Learning will collect them and offer them to the panelists once the Q&A session begins. Finally, I'd like to thank Alexis LeBerge in Alumni Engagement for handling the technology issues for us this evening. Professor Humston, please get us started. The Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm gonna make sure I know how to share my screen here and we'll get going. All right, hopefully y'all are looking at my first slide. So first off, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It is great to see so many people engaging with this series. It's been well attended, and appreciate seeing names of some of my former students on the list too. You know who you are, so thanks for coming. Tonight's seminar is going to follow sort of the same progression as water might follow across the globe. Basically, we're going to be starting tonight with talking about inland waters and freshwater systems. And just like those freshwater systems would flow into the oceans, the next topic is going to be our coastal oceans, or Lisa Greer is going to be talking about corals. And then we're going to move on out into the depths of the broader oceans, where Laura Strickler will be talking about ocean resources and international governance. So that's sort of how things are going to flow tonight. Let's see if I can, there we go. And I'm going to be mainly talking about threats to freshwater resources. I'm going to try to keep this as general as possible. We could be talking about this for an entire semester, and I really don't want to induce despair. There's obviously many different things that would be considered threats to freshwater resources right now. I'm going to sort of take a broader view, talk about the general categories of threats and sort of some of their interesting challenges, and then take a minute to focus in a little bit on human sources of pollution and the research that's going on at W&L to address that. The first thing to think about is, where is the water on our globe? So the vast majority of water is actually in our oceans. Over 96% of the water is in our oceans, and a very, very small portion of our water is in freshwater. When you look at that freshwater that's on the globe, very little of it is actually in the water that we actually access and is available to us in the form of either groundwater or surface water. And so only a very small portion of fresh water is actually available to us. And that's one of the reasons why it's of such concern that there are these mounting threats to freshwater resources. We don't have a whole lot of backups, and the reservoir of water in our oceans does not function the same way for us, doesn't offer us the same things. So in order to understand some of the threats to water, it's important to understand what we call the hydrologic cycle. And the hydrologic cycle describes the movement of water between various compartments or various reservoirs in either vapor form or in liquid form or solid form across the globe. And basically what happens is the power of the sun drives evaporation either from surface waters or waters released into the atmosphere through plants. And then gravity basically kicks back in after the water condensates, falls back to the earth, and then gravity can either take it into below ground sources, reservoirs, or it can take it into surface water reservoirs, which will eventually run back towards the oceans. Now, it's important to note that the energy that drives this is derived from the sun. It's the heat of the sun and the heat of our planet that drives evaporation. And that is basically what moves water against gravity and allows gravity then to eventually take control again and drive it back down to Earth and into these above and below ground reservoirs. The major categories of threats to freshwater resources can be described basically in these four sort of groups. First is general destruction and degradation of our freshwater ecosystems. And that's really where I spend a lot of my time working. I work a little bit on stream restoration. I'm a fish ecologist by training, and so I look a lot at how, basically I think of water as fish habitat. And so I look a lot at how threats to freshwater ecosystems have affected our fish populations. But I also look a little bit at pollution from human activity in various ways. And other threats include water extraction and depletion, something we've been hearing about really for going on about 100 years now. And of course, climate change. And the interesting thing about climate change is that climate change is going to affect our freshwater resources, but it also has the potential to amplify or complicate the effects of these other three categories of stressors. So let's start with climate change. The reason I told you to note that the energy that drives the hydrologic cycle comes from the sun, from the heat of the sun, and that powers evaporation. That says a lot about how climate change is going to affect our freshwater resources. It is going to alter our hydrologic cycle by accelerating evaporation in some areas, accelerating precipitation in other areas, and basically changing the spatial and temporal distribution of water in the various reservoirs or compartments of the hydrologic cycle. And it's going to be a challenge because not every place is going to be affected the same way. Some places are going to end up with less water on average than is normally there. Other places are going to end up with more water on average than is normally there. And it's a little bit difficult to predict at this time. But it is most certainly going to change many of our freshwater ecosystems fundamentally by changing the inputs or outputs of water from them. The degradation of freshwater ecosystems is in and of itself a semester-long topic. It comes into many different categories. The ones that I think we don't hear enough about are the losses of our riparian forests, which are the forests that are on either side, particularly of rivers, but generally line waterways around freshwaters. Losses of wetlands, where we have either filling of wetlands to provide stable landforms for building and for development, or in some cases we have simply degradation of wetland from neighboring development. And then we have alteration of river flows. This one is a little bit less intuitive, but changing the flow of a river or trying to constrain it so that it doesn't flood as much and damage nearby land areas, that disconnects the water from the land in ways that the system has sort of evolved to rely on. And what it typically does is it sends more water downstream during flood periods and leads to more scouring types of floods in many cases. So it's a little bit more complex, but the alteration of water flows through dams and levees has had significant effects on many freshwater ecosystems. And that's important because our freshwater ecosystems connect our landforms and our watersheds with our oceans. And that's a theme that we'll come back to at the end of this section of the talk. As we degrade those systems, we reduce their capacity to filter out contaminants. So everything that happens to water in a river has the potential to filter out some of the contaminants that can naturally enter it through geologic sources or can be introduced through human activity. When water falls on the surface of the earth in the form of rain, the soils itself can filter some of those contaminants out if it gets picked up, or if it comes down in the form in our rainwater from atmospheric pollution. The vegetation that it encounters as it rolls downhill, flows downhill, or slides under in the soil capillary system can also filter out many of these pollutants and filter out many of these contaminants. And then finally, just flowing through rivers where it encounters algae, other organisms that can also take it up, that can hold it up longer for longer periods of time and potentially cycle it out of the system. All of these natural filtration mechanisms are the functions of natural intact freshwater systems. And as we remove riparian vegetation, as we remove or degrade wetlands along freshwater systems, or as we change the flow of rivers, we actually reduce the capability of those systems to naturally filter those contaminants. And that's important because many of us rely on surface waters for our drinking water. Right here in Lexington, our drinking water comes from the Maury River. And so we rely heavily on the natural filtration mechanisms of the upland water wetlands, as well as the smaller streams that feed into the Maury to reduce the amount of those contaminants before they accumulate in the larger river. The pollution is the one I think that most people sort of know about, hear about, certainly, and connect with. The picture in the lower left there, I'm not sure how many people know about this. Many of you probably heard that famously the Cuyahoga River caught on fire a couple of times in the 20th century, most notably in 1969, shortly after the release of Silent Spring and at the dawn of the sort of environmental era and environmental movement. And it caught the attention of a lot of people. I mean, a fire on a body of water just isn't natural. And the source of that pollution was a lot of times coming in from stormwater sewer systems and things like that. It's putting chemicals into our rivers that are then potentially flammable. But water pollution comes in a lot of other forms as well, and sometimes a little bit less noticeable what's the right term? Not necessarily less concerning, but it doesn't always strike us as cause for concern to human health. So in the upper right-hand photo there, what you see is an algae bloom that's been induced by nutrient pollution, all the swirling gray stuff in the water, different forms of algae and cyanobacteria, and that's spurred by the input of nutrients like nitrogen and particularly phosphorus that come in from human sources like fertilizers or in phosphates coming from detergents and things like that. In the lower right-hand corner is a picture of microplastics, which is something that we're all becoming increasingly aware of and has become a more or less ubiquitous source of pollution in many of our freshwaters. We hear about it a lot in our oceans, but in fact, the research I'm doing right now with some colleagues at the University of Maryland indicates that there's actually quite a bit of microplastics accumulating in our rivers and in our lakes as well. And it's not just our surface waters that are subject to pollution. The USGS recently noted that 1 out of 5 drinking water sources from groundwater aquifers was polluted with either naturally occurring or human-sourced pollution or contaminants that exceeded the levels recommended to protect human health. Since roughly 1/3 of the population gets its drinking water from groundwater sources, that's a significant concern because that suggests that literally 1 out of 5 of us is exposed to potentially high levels of contaminants in groundwater sources. And much of that groundwater pollution comes from human sources. Some of it is also from natural sources or what we call geologic sources. The the real challenge with some of this pollution is that it doesn't always connect with human health concerns, and that's where a lot of the regulations for pollution are derived, is from threats to human health presented by pollutants. In the case of nutrients, there's typically not a direct threat to human health. Nitrites and things like that accumulate sometimes to problematic levels might be of concern. But in the case of phosphorus, there typically isn't too many concerns for human health, but the algae blooms that they induce can lead to production of toxins, which can poison fish and poison humans. And that can include poisoning humans that aren't in the water or even using the water, because these toxins can become airborne through wave action and things like that, and cause respiratory illness. So water pollution is a really tricky problem, because a lot of times some of its challenges are relatively subtle. So one of the first challenges with water pollution and regulating water pollution is identifying the problem in the first place. So for example, the more recently, you may have heard about PFASs, or PFAS, I think is the common acronym for them. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the chemical name for them, but this is something that's been around for a long time. It's it's common in industrial uses, many different industrial uses, and is found in many drinking water sources, soils, etc. It wasn't until relatively recently that the EPA has noted that it presents a threat to human health. And so this is an example of a problem that's been around for a long time, but we didn't actually identify it as a problem until relatively recently. And there's lots of reasons for that. But then even once a problem is defined by relatively objective standards, there's still the subjective acceptance of whether or not that is a problem. Here in Rockbridge County, there's the problem with surface water pollution from bacteria. And bacterial pollution is a problem if you spend time in the water. If you don't want to be exposed to those bacteria through either swimming in the water, fishing in the water, etc. But there are many people who don't spend much time in the water, if at all. And to them, the regulations to try to limit the amount of bacteria that go into the water are too onerous to justify to be justified by the problem itself. To them, the problem is tolerable and the regulations are not. And so really there's always this challenge of different stakeholders having different definitions of how big a problem is, or whether or not it actually is a problem. And that's a real challenge with water pollution. Identifying and controlling sources of pollution is easier said than done. If it is a point source, that is a place that we can find these contaminants being introduced, it's relatively easy to monitor, maybe not as easy to regulate, depending on the dynamics that are putting it into the system. But non-point sources are probably one of our biggest challenges for regulating and monitoring pollution. And non-point sources are sort of diffuse sources where it's not one pipe or one smokestack that's putting the pollutant out. Instead, it's coming off of an entire landscape. That could be nutrient pollution coming from pet waste in a large park. It could be nutrient pollution coming from fertilizers applied in agricultural fields, things like that. It's difficult to put a number on how much contribution non-point sources is to the overall problem of water pollution. And then finally, even when we identify a problem, can regulate the source of the problem, we still have the problem of legacy effects from pollutants that can stay in our systems for a long, long time and can be very, very difficult to clean up. So water pollution is a really particularly challenging problem for the next century. And there's a lot that can be done in that field. And there is a lot being done here at the university. So Professor Hinkle in geology, she studies manganese levels. So manganese is a micronutrient that's essential for human health, but at high levels it can cause many different health problems. The problems in adults are similar to sort of like Parkinson's disease, but there's also recent research that shows that even chronic exposures to low levels of manganese pollution can lead to infant hearing loss and a lot of other problems. So Professor Hinkle is studying how manganese can be remediated from our systems. Manganese is a common feature of areas that have pollution from mine tailings. And so all the way from Pennsylvania down through West Virginia and into Virginia, this is a problem in many of the watersheds where coal mining was a common common activity. So Professor Hinkle's research, though, is trying to find ways to use biological organisms like fungi and things like that to help with the remediation process. And actually, she's making a lot of progress on that front. Some of the results coming out of her lab, she's able to reduce the amount of manganese in water. I think it's like somewhere along the order of 10 times faster than what the traditional methods are, which are typically very slow. Students in my lab have done a lot of work related to nutrient pollution. A lot of it focuses on the bacterial pollution in our local waters, but also the downstream impacts of nutrient pollution. More recently, as I mentioned, I'm doing some work on microplastics in coastal rivers. And we've also studied a lot about how some of these different pollutants can be remedied or their effects can be reduced through stream restoration work. And most recently, the stream restoration I've been working on that many of you may have heard of and some of you may not, 2019. Sorry, it's been 3 years now. I almost said last year. It's been a minute, hasn't it? In 2019, the dam on the Maury River at Jordan Point was removed, and it's changed the face of the river. They've really done a wonderful job with it, and you're starting to see some restoration of the bank habitats and things like that along the river. So my students and I have been following that along as well, and Professor Harbour in geology has also been doing some work there. So ultimately, we often think about water issues as local issues. We often don't notice water pollution and things like that until it's sort of in our backyard and affecting us. But the truth is that, like the effects of nutrient pollution, which we don't really feel here, but the nutrients that pollute our local waters affect areas like the Chesapeake Bay or the tidal waters of the James. The downstream effects of pollution can be significant. And so water connects the world, and the upstream problems will eventually find their way into the downstream communities. So we need to focus not just on the problems in our own backyards, but we need to focus more broadly on the protection and conservation of resources as a global issue, and one that requires international cooperation. A perfect example of this is how freshwater pollution has impacts on our coastal marine environments, which many times the pollution that comes out of one water body can affect coastal environments in other international zones. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to spend a little bit of time talking about coastal oceans and coral reefs.
There we go. I assume you can see my screen now. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about coral reefs. Like Robert said, our coral reefs are connected to the things that we do and how we manage the landscape, locally as well as globally. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about one ecosystem, one location, and the work that I've been lucky to do since being at WNL with coral reefs. So the idea here is that coral reefs are in trouble and we should all care about it. So that's sort of the focus or theme of my part of our conversation. Whoops, 1 second here. There we go. So when we think about coral reefs, sometimes here we are in Virginia, we're nowhere near a coral reef. And so it's hard to contextualize why reefs might be important to us, why they might be important to people who might never actually even visit a coral reef. And it turns out that coral reefs provide a lot for a lot of people, and we're connected to coral reefs in some pretty fundamental ways. So we can think about income and food. It turns out that, coral reefs have a commercial value in the US. Just the fisheries that are connected to coral reefs are on the order of $100 million, but local economies get billions from the infrastructure that, fisheries that are connected to coral reefs provide. And think about it. When you buy fish, someone's processed it, someone caught it. And so we're all connected if we choose to eat seafood. So it's critical to fisheries that coral reefs thrive. This is where the juveniles live until they're big enough to go out on their own. This is where the ecosystem dynamics support thriving populations of certain species. Coral reefs also provide shoreline protection for many of the places that we'd certainly like to go and visit, but places where people live and they need that protection from the waves. They buffer up to 98% of the energy that waves bring towards shore in some locations. Carbon sinks. So I'm going to circle back to this in a minute and talk about how we are connected to corals. Because they actually absorb some of the excess carbon in the atmosphere for us. Biological diversity. We can think about how biological diversity is a wonderful thing to have. And we can think about, endangered species as something that, is ethically important to us. But it turns out that coral reefs, the biological diversity of coral reefs, are what NOAA calls the medicine cabinets of the 21st century. So corals and reef organisms are already being used to treat cancer, arthritis, even broken bones. So we are going to be needing these diverse ecosystems if we want to look at furthering some of our medical advances. Now, corals and carbon. This is one way that corals are connected to all of us. So corals capture or essentially they use the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when it's dissolved in the water. They make their skeletons with carbon, with oxygen and calcium. And so what they do is they sequester, they take in some of that CO2, the carbon and the oxygen, lock it into their skeleton, and as long as they're alive and it's locked away and they don't dissolve, they're holding on to that carbon. And the oceans are right now absorbing much of the excess carbon that we're putting up in the atmosphere. So by some estimates, about half, sometimes even more, with a capacity that's even greater. So without the reefs to sequester the carbon, we get more carbon in the atmosphere. What happens is that as the reefs, or as we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, our oceans become more acidic. And acid is a severe problem to a coral. It's called ocean acidification. And what happens is that when the pH is too low for corals to thrive, they stop forming, they stop taking in that carbon, and instead they actually start venting it back out to the atmosphere as they dissolve. So they lock it in when they're alive, and when they're gone, it goes right back up into the atmosphere and sort of doubles our trouble. Threats to coral reefs. There are many different threats to coral reefs, and I would say that they're sort of synergistic. So overfishing and the loss of key herbivores like sea urchins on the reef. What this does is when we take those organisms out of the mix, the algae thrive. So these are organisms that eat algae, and algae can outcompete corals for space, making it difficult for corals to find purchase. Diseases are running rampant in some areas of the Caribbean: stony coral tissue loss and white band disease. Ocean acidification. So excess CO2 in the atmosphere dissolves into the ocean, makes it hard for corals to form. Microplastics. The microplastics that are floating around in our ocean look like food to a coral. The small particles, the coral will actually ingest the microplastics thinking that that's food. And as you know, there's no nutritional value here. So the corals can actually starve by ingesting too much of that plastic. Nutrients and sewage that are coming off of the landscape, like Robert was talking about, through our river systems, phosphorus, nitrogen, they are food for algae, and again, help the algae out-compete for space. And of course, there's climate change, sediment stress, and even recreational damage, anchor damage, and boats that run into reefs. So these are all problems that can happen. This picture below is a schematic that is showing, demonstrating the idea, the concept that as temperature increases and as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, that's the ppm there, as that does, it becomes harder and harder for the corals to thrive. So we go from, on the left, there's a fish floating around on a beautiful Pacific coral. In the middle, it's getting tough for a lot of the coral species to thrive, particularly the delicate ones. And so some persist, some do not. And on the right is our scenario where algae have overtaken the reef. And what I would say is it's not just about climate change, it's about all of these factors. But any one of these or any combination of these make it more difficult for corals to handle the stress of temperature and ocean acidification. So it's not looking good for coral reefs out there. Many of you have probably heard this in the news. This is a graph from a paper that's quite well known and it's cited thousands of times. And I just drew in, it's not statistically sound here, that red fuzzy line, but just to demonstrate that in the 1970s, this was a meta study of lots of different publications and areas in the Caribbean. And it shows that in the 1970s, the average coral reef had about 50% live coral on it. And in 2000, it was down to 10%. And that's true for the Pacific as well. So we're seeing this massive decline in living coral on coral reefs. So I'll just talk a little bit about the kinds of work that I've been doing with students at Washington and Lee, because I'm very interested in the shift from thinking about why coral reefs die, why corals die, to finding reefs that work. And what can we do with that information? That's really, I think, where we need to be heading. It's all important, but we know many of the reasons that corals are not thrive or able to survive. Let's find the ones that work, study them, document them, understand why they're resilient, and let's see what we can do with that information to help other coral reefs thrive. So what can we do to make this happen? These are some of my students from last year: Alicia, Jordan, Lily, Jenny, and that's us out on the reef. And then my very favorite co-author of all is Al Curran on the bottom, who is WNL class of 62. And we've collaborated on many projects over the years and still continue to. So the kind of work I do is pretty varied. I do some geochemistry. I do radiocarbon and uranium thorium dating to understand the ages of reefs. Have done some really fun genetic work, understanding the genetic properties of some of our corals, habitat surveys, watching fish and where they sit and how much algae they're eating. But the bread and butter of a lot of what I have been doing in the past years, I'll show you in a minute, is this long-term study in Coral Gardens, Belize. So over 40 students have contributed in summer research while at WNL and a few other schools. And it's really amazing what our students have done. So the focus of every year changes a little bit with some background level information so that the interests at hand can be explored. You have all of the students get scuba certified. You've got AJ on the left doing a fish survey, Adele in the middle doing some genetics work, Lily and Jordan at the bottom that are looking at temperature data, Nick and Jolie taking field measurements, and then occasionally they get to play with sharks, which is also really fun. The heart of this study is monitoring one reef through the years. So we started in 2011, and there are about 136 meter square areas of reef that I survey every year. So we take a photograph, we use some software, and we trace the living coral tissue in that square every year to understand how the reef is doing. And I'll tell you that the bad news is that Coral Gardens has declined in live coral cover since the beginning of the study. But the good news is that it seems to have leveled and even bounced back a little bit in the last 2 years after a really tough year in 2016 when it was extra warm. So we're hoping to see those results continue. Also, we're doing some 3D photogrammetry, which is super exciting. That is Jordan in the big picture there, and taking hundreds of pictures around one small coral and trying to use that data to reconstruct in 3 dimensions in a usable software space what that coral looks like. The idea here is the corals that are left, how well do they support a thriving ecosystem? How many urchins can fit in these new coral habitats compared to the old ones? How many juvenile fish can live in the spaces between those branches? So that's really exciting, fun work for me. But what I'm most interested in right now is what we can do with that knowledge. There's the science, and there's all kinds of interesting questions that we can ask of the reef. But I'm pretty excited about a new direction for this study. So in December of 2020, despite COVID, I actually was able to go to the site and work with colleagues and friends from several Belizean nonprofits and government organizations. The whole Chan Marine Reserve, Keycocker, Bacalar Chico, as well as I would encourage you to look at Fragments of Hope. They do really wonderful work with reseeding reefs that are in decline or challenged. And I'll show you a quick video here of what we did in December. Folks, about 16 people came, collected samples from coral gardens for the first time, and took it back, strung them out on strings, which you'll see, and planted them out on nursery tables to grow. And I'll play this video here. And so this is Coral Gardens. It's just an amazing resource. 98% of these corals are gone in the Caribbean, but we have a lot of them thriving at Coral Gardens. And there's Henry, you see me zooming through there, who's collecting some samples for the nursery. And so what we were able to do, they did the work, I got to participate. Now they document the size of these so we can measure growth rate every year. They're taking genetic tissue samples, and then they're stringing it out on this table that sits in a protected area of the reef for the corals to grow. Now take a look at the size of those coral branches. So that was what they looked like in December of 2020. And that's the team setting up a brand new nursery table in this area. Whoops, sorry. And this is what they looked like in this summer. So already, if you look closely at this photograph, the corals are overgrowing the rope. They're actually growing more branches, right? And so they are thriving in this nursery spot. And I had the great fortune to go and pick algae off of the rope. And that was fun, just to see them thriving like this. And so, and I went back again, I've been back a couple of times, and they're still, as of December of this year, doing really well, growing more. And now in January, the team came back and broke off some of these branches and cemented them to key locations on the reef so that they can grow out in the wild. And they'll keep growing and feeding the reef with these samples. So that's the kind of work, coral reefs are in trouble. I'm so fortunate to work on a reef that works. What's needed though is a lot of effort, and resources and regulations. And that's where Laura's the expert. And so I'm excited to hear what she can share with us about what she knows about regulations.
Nothing could be worse than the pesky moderator injecting himself, but I want to remind our audience to go ahead and submit questions for one or all of our panelists. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now, Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sorry, I was having a hard time taking myself off mute and sharing at the same time, but I think I've got it now. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So good evening, everyone, and thanks to the Lifelong Learning Program for having me. I'm delighted to be here. As Bo mentioned, I'm Laura Strickler, and I graduated in 2008. And after graduate school, have spent the majority of my career working for the federal government in technical and regulatory agencies, but as an international policy specialist. So this largely means that I advocate for science-based US foreign policy on marine governance and marine resource issues. And I have the pleasure of representing the United States at relevant negotiations as well. I'm compelled to tell you that I'm here in my personal capacity, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of my agency, the department, or the broader US government. And with that, we will get on to the more substantive part of what I'd like to talk to you about. So this map shows the US exclusive economic zone, a political boundary that goes 200 nautical miles off the US coast, separating areas within national jurisdiction, so areas under US control, such as the freshwater areas Robert touched on, and some of the coral reefs, but obviously not the ones in Belize that Lisa talked about, from areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the areas within national jurisdiction are the colorful bubbles you see all around the US coast. And then the areas beyond national jurisdiction are the majority of the map, the light blue area that belongs to everyone or to no one, depending on how you want to think about it. But the reality is that we really have one ocean connected worldwide that doesn't really adhere to the political boundaries that we've put on it. And much of what the United States does in its EEZ, its exclusive economic zone, impacts other countries' EEZs, and much of human activity affects the ocean globally, both within and beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So I think it's important to keep in mind that a connected ocean necessitates international cooperation and regulations, but a connected ocean also complicates international cooperation given humanity's political realities and how we've divvied up the world. So you might be more connected to nautical mile 201 than you think, and both Robert and Lisa touched on this, which was great. Some of the most common uses of the areas beyond national jurisdiction, or colloquially the high seas. If you use the internet today, which you probably are right now, likely a cable laying somewhere on the seafloor was involved in some form in bringing you the internet. That's the image in the top left. Lisa touched on this, but if you've had tuna or another pelagic fish for dinner recently, it likely came from, or at least swam through, the high seas, and maybe even an area that's managed by a regional fisheries management organization, which we'll touch on later. If you, like many Americans, are disgruntled with supply chain and distribution woes at the moment, you may be more aware today than you were 2-something years ago that international shipping transports nearly 90% of all of global trade over the high seas. And lastly, for all of us who have smartphones, some components of them require what we call critical minerals, such as cobalt, lithium, and manganese, which are abundant on the seafloor. You can see this image in the bottom right. That's a manganese nodule field. They're like potato-sized rocks with high-grade minerals in them, but they are still untouched on the seafloor, and we'll come back to this as well. We're also connected to marine areas beyond national jurisdiction in less direct ways. As we heard last week, the ocean is responsible for 50 to 80% of Earth's oxygen production. Marine scientific research discovers new species in the deep sea and the high seas fairly frequently, and also monitors the impacts of global increased carbon dioxide emissions. So again, as Lisa mentioned, the ocean absorbs a significant portion of the carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere, which causes ocean acidification. It's also absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat in the Earth system from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which of course makes the ocean warmer. And a warmer ocean has ripple effects throughout the 70% of the surface of the planet that it covers. For example, warmer water in the Arctic contributes to sea ice melt, which impacts currents that go beyond the Arctic region itself. And perhaps a little more tangible, commercial fish stocks all over the world are starting to migrate northward to stay in the cooler waters that constitute their habitat range. So the ocean is changing, and we use it for all sorts of things, including oxygen. So what are we going to do about it? And before I talk in a little bit more detail about what the international community is doing today, I want to take us back to put it in context of how we got to where we are and how we got to, in particular, the legal framework that really guides and serves as the backbone of all of international marine cooperation efforts today. So it's not to say that the challenges we're facing today aren't unprecedented. They are. The ocean's changing very quickly, and it can be overwhelming and intimidating. But it's important to keep in mind that we have had challenges in ocean governance before, pretty much as far back as humanity goes, but we'll start with the 17th century. The two main uses at the time were fishing and shipping for trade, and at the time managing the ocean and finding a proper balance of rights and obligations, rectifying the tension between the appropriation of fishing rights in particular and the freedom of high seas necessary for the international trade then and that we see today was not an easy task. It led this guy, Dutch legal thinker Hugo Grotius, to write a philosophy piece in response to the political tension at the time, in particular Dutch competition in seafaring trade with the Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And in his piece, The Free Sea, he formulated the new principle at the time that the sea was international territory, belonged to everyone, and all nations were free to use it for peaceful seafaring trade. The pro-fishing folks, the coastal states that relied heavily on fishing, got a little bit of space for themselves as well, and it resulted in a dynamic where a sliver of water near every coastal state was set aside for that state's fishing rights, and then the rest of the entire ocean was free for trade. And this principle, this concept of freedom of the high sea really does reign supreme today. And that 90% of global trade that's carried with international shipping relies entirely upon all countries agreeing to this idea of the freedom of the high seas. So admittedly, fast forwarding a few centuries to post-World War II, the world has shifted dramatically, dealing with bigger problems than regional trade tensions. And international cooperation through diplomacy and organizations is increasingly seen as necessary to avoiding these global wars. So we see the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, the establishment of the International Maritime Organization to govern the shipping that I keep talking about in 1948. And after decades of negotiation and renegotiation that began in 1958, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention entered into force in 1994 with near universal support. And it notes its contribution to the maintenance of peace, justice, and progress for all peoples of the world in the preamble, and includes a part dedicated to the protection and the preservation of the marine environment, in large part thanks to the growing environmental awareness in the late 60s and 70s that Robert touched on, which was during some of the heat of these decades-long negotiations. And so again, it took a really long time, but in the end, the international community was able to rise to the challenge and create the legal framework that we use today for pretty much all international marine discussions, negotiations, cooperation at whatever level. So these next two slides, I'm not going to go into too much detail because they are pretty technical, but I want to use them to highlight two big things that the Law of the Sea Convention did. The first is that it provided the functional division of ocean space that we still use today. So it established that 200 nautical mile line of the exclusive economic zone around every country, every coastal state, as well as a couple of other areas and regions, which you can see here. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I'm not going to bore you with this whole chart. So the impact of this is that it made the ocean much more manageable from a human perspective. It sort of divvied up the ocean and organized it in a way that makes sense to us so that we have a basis for communication across cultures and across different ocean users. On the flip side, it doesn't necessarily match how the ocean functions chemically or physically or biologically. So it's not always, perfect or fail-safe. And even though the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, much of it has become what we call customary international law, which means we essentially abide by it anyway and expect others to as well. And we benefit significantly from it. I mean, it is the reason that our Navy in particular is allowed to roam the globe without altercation, because of the principle of the freedom of the high seas that is further enshrined in the Law of the Sea Convention. The other big thing that it did was to lay a foundation for a management regime based on the activities that are taking place beyond national jurisdiction. So again, I'm not going to bore you with every detail of this, but you can see in the middle right, there's the International Maritime Organization, which regulates shipping. Above that is the International Seabed Authority, which is responsible for the management of the manganese nodules we saw earlier. And then I mentioned as well the regional fisheries management organizations, which are regional organizations of states with big fishing fleets that fish for pelagic fish that cross political boundaries, essentially to get together and decide on a quota scheme to ensure that any given commercial stock is not overfished. It's not perfect. It's undeniably, this shows very well that it's fractured and messy, but it has largely fulfilled the promise of stability and rule of law on the high seas and avoiding significant global wars and naval warfare. Again, it's not without exception. We heard last week about how difficult it can be to enforce some regulations on the high seas, and nefarious actors use it for illegal fishing and human trafficking and drug trafficking. But sort of at the 10,000 foot level, it's still, we're still using it today. We still use it as the basis for communication with other countries and for multilateral negotiations. So after the Law of the Sea Convention entered into force in the 90s, environmental awareness continued to grow. We increased our understanding of human impacts. And so with that, we also better understand issues, or new issues emerge that we didn't even know were issues before, based on human impacts. Scientific knowledge also advances significantly. Today we know that chemosynthesis and the existence of life in the deep sea is well known. You learn it in a basic marine biology class. But at the time, for most of the time, actually, that the Law of the Sea Convention was being negotiated, not for the entire time, but for the most of it, the global thought was that it was just mud and rocks down there, that there were no hydrothermal vents or deep sea corals or anything that could live without photosynthesis, without the sunlight. And a lot of this life is co-located with the critical minerals that I mentioned before, with those manganese nodule fields, hydrothermal vents. Here you can see a shrimp on a hydrothermal vent, and the other type of mineral area is called a cobalt crust. Both Robert and Lisa touched on plastic pollution. Of course, I think the increased awareness in ocean plastic pollution is real. It's grown quite a bit. And microplastics are everywhere. They're in the most remote regions of the world. They're in freshwater, as we heard. They're also in the Arctic. They flow up there in ocean currents. They get trapped in sea ice. They float around in sea ice flows. And then in the spring or summer, the sea ice melts and releases them in another part of the Arctic Ocean or a different current. And then, of course, we've talked about with ocean acidification and ocean warming, the ocean is changing, and it's changing fast. So what are we trying to do about it today? The international community, within the legal framework of the Law of the Sea Convention, is trying to address a number of these issues at the global level as one piece of the larger puzzle that also requires regional, national, and local efforts. So on the biodiversity front, there are active negotiations on biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So the living marine resources that are in that light blue part of the map from the first slide, in the area of the ocean that no one country has exclusive jurisdiction over. Part of the objective of the BB&J negotiations and ultimately the treaty is to help bridge some of the fractured nature in the global governance system that I showed you earlier. It's focused on the conservation and sustainable use of the living marine resources. So it's from a biodiversity perspective, it's governance from a biodiversity perspective, as opposed to governance from a single activity perspective, like shipping or fishing or seabed mining. It's also intended, ideally, to address climate change and other stressors of the modern and active ocean that we have today. One example of this is global discussions under the treaty negotiations on marine protected areas are now including the concept of potentially dynamic marine protected areas. So an ambulatory MPA that could be timed to be more compatible with subsistence users, for example, or perhaps it's just an MPA during a specific time that a certain fish is spawning because the rest of the year there are other uses that are more valuable. As opposed to just stable, indefinite marine protected areas, to try to adapt to some of what the realities of human uses of the ocean and the types of changes that we're seeing today, in particular with climate change. And again, as I said, with habitats moving northward or poleward. On marine plastic pollution, there's growing momentum at the United Nations Environmental Assembly for a treaty on marine plastics. They are meeting later this year to consider whether or not they want to launch treaty negotiations on that. And under the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, there's a priority area of oceans, coastal areas, and ecosystems. And the folks that engage there are focused on what we call the ocean climate nexus. So this connection between carbon dioxide emissions, the atmosphere, and the ocean, to share knowledge, better and best practices, to better understand, predict, and manage the quickly changing ocean. And then one issue that is on the horizon or is here already in some discussions that I work a lot on at BOEM now is sort of this paradox. Getting carbon out of the atmosphere is critical to bolstering ocean health. I think we've heard that a lot tonight. But many renewable energy technologies that we have today, such as offshore wind turbines or electric vehicle batteries, require these critical minerals that are abundant on the seafloor in high grade. They're abundant and high grade on the seafloor in the nodules on the near the hydrothermal vents and the cobalt crust that I mentioned. So some argue that technology providing gathering manganese nodules in particular from the seabed would be less environmentally and socially destructive than continuing to mine on land in vulnerable communities for lower and lower grade minerals. While other argue that we know very little about the deep sea. Indeed, it's an area of the earth that has been less explored by humans than the moon. And we shouldn't disturb the deep sea ecosystem until we better understand how it connects to all the other ecosystems and what the impacts might be, including potential impacts on the carbon cycle. So this is not a comfortable paradox for anyone, for ocean preservationists, for ocean users, for ocean managers, and any solutions are unlikely to be perfect, but talking to each other across culture, values, and political boundaries about how to deal with these paradoxes, to me, is the only real way we're going to make any progress on these inherently global issues, and we've managed to rise to the challenges before. So international cooperation, as I said, is one piece in the larger scheme of ocean stewardship efforts. And in particular, it keeps dialogue open on issues of global concern like climate change with both our allies and our competitors, because as we know, the ocean is globally connected. So I'll end with a proverb that might be a little cheesy, but I find it very applicable to international negotiations. It's a little bit of my mantra because I'm not a particularly patient person, and these negotiations take a long time. So if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And thanks again for everyone's time.
Well, we're grateful, and I'll come back to that, but I don't want to waste a minute. We have a number of really good, thought-provoking questions. Ruth and Rob, take it away, and let's continue this conversation.
Thank you, Bo, and thank you, Laura, Lisa, and Robert for some very provocative presentations. The questions are still coming in. So let me go all the way back to you, Robert, in your initial discussion. There were several alarms for all of us, of course, in your remarks. One of them was the increasing pollution of our aquifers, our sources, and the groundwater that we draw from for irrigation and for drinking, for consumption. Are you finding any biological solutions to the pollution, increasing pollution of the aquifers?
I am not working on that myself directly. The problem with tracing pollution in aquifers is the challenge of tracing water underground. To be honest, it's very, very difficult because aquifers are not the structure of aquifers is not very clear from above ground, from the surface, and very often there are discontinuities and connections in places we don't expect, and then lack of connections in places we expect. So the first and most important challenge is often determining the source of the pollution and then trying to figure out the best way to remediate it, because accessing aquifers is not straightforward, and really treating water in aquifers is probably not going to be in the long term as effective as trying to address pollution at its source.
Thank you.
Lisa, this question is for you. You had mentioned that coral gardens have bounced back a little bit in the last 2 years. Do you think this is correlating with lower human activity during the pandemic, or is this recovery sustainable?
That's an excellent question. The short answer is I don't have an answer for that yet. But what we are really honing in on, and this is in partnership with my colleague, Kira Foreman-Castillo, who works for the whole Chan Marine Reserve, is really trying to understand, 2016 was a hard hit. It was one of the warmest years on record, and the corals felt it. We have the temperature data to show that. There was also a hurricane that went near, although we don't think that was the main problem because there wasn't a lot of physical damage there. What we've seen, though, is that after that short, sharp shock, it seems as though the temperature data after that, it's not that it was cooler, but it was less variable for the next year and a half. We're starting to think that one of the reasons coral gardens is thriving is because it doesn't suffer from these other threats. So we're wondering if perhaps it has not an immunity, but it's able to handle that temperature stress a little bit better because there's no runoff from industrial sources there. There's no sediment stress. It's not heavily trafficked, so the boat and anchor damage is not there. So we're kind of thinking it's because of a lack of stressors. People aren't fishing there very much because they can get tangled in that coral. So I think that it's possible that with less visits during COVID, it might have had some impact. I definitely think that. I think we might see that maybe even in the next couple of years to see if that's really operational there.
Thank you.
Laura, it's a question for you regarding the near universal cooperation of the world's nations on the regulation of rights to the high seas. It was generally an optimistic assessment of how the nations of the world are coming together to regulate access and to monitor pollution in the world's oceans. But here's a question from a member of our audience, and I think for you, do you see oceans management becoming more conflict-ridden as the climate crisis intensifies? Has this commission, this Convention on the Sea, anticipated increasing lack of cooperation among our nations in that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think it cuts both ways, not to cop out of a difficult answer. But on the one hand, the Pfas changes, so the biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction the active negotiations I mentioned that should be finishing up this year. Part of what precipitated those going from just a discussion group to treaty negotiations is the crisis, the biodiversity crisis in the seas, and people really putting aside some of their other political, top lines or red lines to say, okay, this is a real problem, and the only way to solve it is together. On the flip side, as the climate crisis becomes, as impacts become more frequent and more severe, and countries like Kiribati are facing a literal existential threat, small island developing states and those countries that have contributed least to climate change and are suffering, in some cases, the brunt of it, are going to continue to ask for more and more. And the Western European countries and the United States and the developed countries, I'm not sure if they'll keep pace with those demands in a way that keeps keeps the conversations moving as quickly as they need to. I think it remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So this question is from Scott Redman. What, and I'm not really sure who it's for or if anybody wants to chime in and answer it, but what changes have been noticed in krill and plankton populations? Oh, you're muted, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm not sure because it's a little far afield from me. I wouldn't be surprised if there are changes, but I have no idea what the nature of those changes might be.
I can jump in a little bit on this. It's difficult to say that there have been changes that have been observed everywhere, right? I think the changes that have been observed in certain places. There are places where, for example, the effects of ocean acidification seem to be a bit more acute. And so there have been demonstrated effects of ocean acidification in certain areas, and then the same effects haven't been observed in other areas. So it's really difficult to say that there has been a general response of either phytoplankton or krill populations. For example, in the Arctic Ocean, where we have bad years for sea ice, this is one really amazing kind of connection here. Where we have bad years for sea ice, the walrus are not as able to use the sea ice to access deeper areas of the oceans, and so they don't perturb the bottom when they're hunting for food in these deeper areas as much, and so there's actually less nutrients coming out of the bottom water and up into the surface waters. They're apparently that. I didn't realize this before, but walruses are very important bioturbators. They're important for transporting nutrients from one part of the ocean into another part of the ocean. And I believe, I cannot say this for 100% certain, but I believe there have been documented effects on reductions in phytoplankton populations as a result of that reduction in sea ice that corresponds with that. That's research that came out of the University of Virginia, actually. One of the scientists there started it, I want to say something along the lines of 15 years ago, and has been continuing that research so far. But it's difficult to say that there have been specific, changes to phytoplankton and krill populations that are universal.
Thank you, Robert. Here's a question from Craig Shapiro, and it's a question concerning tipping points. And I'll share this with you. He says, I've read a fair bit about climate feedbacks and tipping points. I've become especially concerned with the amplification of climate change in the Arctic, leading to the disintegration of the Greenland ice sheet, and how that influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic slows down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. You've referred to that, Robert, I think in your remarks, causing monsoonal shifts and other regional level climate changes around the planet. Now here's the question, how do we know when we've reached this tipping point that cascades into other tipping points? Anyone like to tackle that one? Laura? No.
Well, I just spent a few weeks on this in my global climate change class. I have 40 students enrolled in that class right now, and they're being tested on it tomorrow. So it's a little bit fresh in my mind. It's a good question. It's absolutely of concern. Perhaps Laura knows better, but models are showing a slowing of that thermohaline circulation, or the AMO. So models are showing it, instrumental data is showing, it's hit the news a couple of times where we see it slow a little bit. In terms of when we've hit that tipping point, it's tough. We're dealing with a system that is out of natural balance. And so what we have are records of the past under a different set of conditions. And so it's really tough to extrapolate, but what we do know is that abrupt change can happen, that it's happened in the past, and that it is something to be very concerned about. When we look at Greenland, the ice is melting. People have known that for a while, but we just went over in class how the news piles up. First of all, okay, we need to look at what's happening at the bottom of the ice and the basal melting. That's increasing the water that's going out into the ocean. And then destabilization of that process is causing earthquakes that shed more ice into the sea. So there are bits and pieces that people are putting together. As far as a tipping point for coral reefs and for others, we're in the midst of watching and hoping that we can intervene before those tipping points happen, I think. And, you know, the kinds of things that Laura's working on here are crucial to avoiding those tipping points. Sadly, the only way we'll know for sure is after it's happened, and we don't want that to happen.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. So there are chemical compounds that have gotten into our bloodstreams through industrial water pollution. Brad Poorman says that in Florida, they have massive fish and manatee deaths from nutrient pollution. How or why do we accelerate getting these problems fixed?
That's a great question. There's some efforts right now to try to, so I think speaking specifically to the case in Florida, that one of the problems in Florida is that the delivery of this nutrient-rich water coming out of the agricultural zones north of Lake Okeechobee has been in the area of Lake Okeechobee has been accelerated because of the construction of canals that are designed to control the flow of water and to actually drop the aquifer a little bit and reduce the soil moisture in a lot of areas and reduce flooding. And this is one of those examples of, like Lisa was referring to, you know, this essentially was a tipping point that we've passed, right? We diverted the water in such a way that we changed the nature of the Everglades, and now we're seeing some of the consequences of this. One of the reasons that it's getting more challenging right now, certainly there's been an increase in agricultural activity with an increasing human population, but there's also the synergistic effects of climate change. As the average water temperature goes up, as the average air temperatures go up, the phytoplankton blooms that produce the toxins that cause deaths of manatees and fish kills and things like that, their growth is accelerated. And so it's sort of a double whammy where you have more nutrients spurring more growth, and then you have better conditions to facilitate that growth. And so in terms of control, the best methods that we have for controlling agricultural sources of water pollution are the reestablishment of riparian buffers and the natural vegetation to help absorb a lot of those nutrients before they have a chance to get into the downstream flow. But there's also advanced methods for fertilizer applications and things like that that can help reduce runoff of fertilizers. And these are methods that are still in development in some cases, or are still being proven in other cases, but they are emerging. And so there's a lot of work being done on the best ways to try to mitigate nutrient pollution, and a lot of people working on that recognize that the problem is accelerating with climate change. And so personally, I think it's going to require a combination of improving filtration methods or filtration capabilities of our natural systems, but also trying to reduce inputs into the systems as well.
Thank you, Robert. Laura, I'd like to ask you a question, and it's from Allie Case. She asks what your thoughts are on the recent push for trying to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. Do you think this is attainable? And will the amount of MPAs required to reach this goal displace local fisheries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 30 by 30, as it's known, as I'm sure Allie knows, has gotten a ton of attention recently. And like many things in the international community, it started with a small group of people calling for it at, I think it started at an IUCN World Conservation Congress, so a pretty environmentally focused conference, maybe a decade or so ago, and then slowly but surely has made its way into the mainstream. I do think it's attainable, and I think it's a start. I think from what I've read, the most recent science suggests we would need to protect any more. And the question to me really becomes, what exactly do you mean by protect? So for example, in the United States, our national sanctuary system, each marine sanctuary is tailored to its location. So the United States government, NOAA, does allow some activities, including recreational fishing, for example, in some of those sanctuaries, even though they're sanctuaries. If you translate marine protected area into Russian, it literally means marine preserve. So every time you talk to a Russian, you have to be very careful to clarify that you're not necessarily talking about a preservation site, that you might be talking about a particularly focused managed site or something like that. There's a lot of ocean out there. I do think it's attainable. The United States is a huge exclusive economic zone. This administration is pushing to protect 30% of it, which will be a huge contribution to the global 30 by 30. But I think the substance is more important than the number in terms of how you're managing the protected area and how you're enforcing it, especially once we start developing marine protected areas on the high seas. Who's responsible for paying for that enforcement? What are the infractions going to be? What is dispute resolution going to look like? It gets pretty wonky pretty quickly.
Yes, I hear you. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. And Lisa, I'm going to ask this of you. This is another great question from Allie Case. There are many unique solutions that are currently being explored that are working to conserve corals, like cryopreservation for gamete banking, using CRISPR to create more heat-tolerating corals, growing coral farms, etc. Do you find any of these solutions more promising than others? And do you think that these have any real promise of saving reefs, or do we need to focus more on preventative solutions?
That's an excellent question from Allie. I am absolutely a proponent of all hands on deck. So it's much like not just coral reefs, when we talk about climate change, what are the solutions to our climate change problem? They have to come from everywhere. And what fits in one location won't necessarily fit in another. The analogy is solar panels are great in Arizona, right? And geothermal is wonderful in Iceland. And, these are varied responses to a problem. And I think it's the same with corals. I am amazed at these coral breeding ideas and genetically modified corals. And now my friends in Belize and a couple of other Caribbean countries are inoculating corals for I think it's stony coral tissue loss, that they're actually out there and inoculating the corals. Now, that won't fix everything. Neither will the fishing regulations alone. But I think it's going to take a little bit of everything. And I have encountered people with a lot of different ideas about how much we should mess with nature. I think we are at a point when there's enough trouble that technology is going to have to be a piece of it. I also think that there's no one technology that's going to fix and ensure the health of coral reefs. But I think, a lot of them put together and the right money going into and resources into these projects, at least give me hope at this point. So.
Well, all good things must come to an end, and I get to play the bad guy. This has been a marvelous conversation about very large issues, and I want to pay thanks to all of our panelists. We basically ask you to do the impossible. Could you take a topic that you teach over the course of multiple semesters and shrink it to under an hour? And somehow you've done it, and you've done it in an intelligent, thought-provoking way. We're in your debt, all three of you. We really appreciate your time and effort to get ready for tonight. Thank you to the audience for being as engaged an audience as I think I've seen in any of these presentations. We clearly have struck a nerve with sustainability and oceans and water. I'd like to encourage everyone to tune in next Tuesday, the 22nd at 7 o'clock. We will be discussing alternative energy sources, the path of sustainability, with a professor and 2 alumni who are engaged in this important work. So thank you again on behalf of Lifelong Learning and Alumni Engagement. Keep a good thought for your university. Thanks for being with us tonight. We hope to see you next Tuesday. Good evening.